All right, Imagine. I think we're good to get started.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us for another installment of the TUFC webinar series. We're really happy to have everybody here. A lot of folks from California, it looks like today. We had a really large amount of registrants. We had, I think, almost 200 people register for today's event. So we're going to have people trickling in as we start. But we're all really glad to have you here. So for today's discussion for our March webinar, we are going to be talking Stoked on Oaks, managing majestic oaks in landscapes. And for our speaker today, we have Patrick Anderson. For those of you that don't know who Patrick Anderson is, he is the Director of Research and Arborologists for Rainbow Ecoscience. He has extensive hands-on tree care experience, and he holds a BS in forest science from Penn State University. Patrick is an ISA board certified master arborist and urban forest professional, ISA tree risk assessment qualified, an ASCA registered consulting arborist, ASCA tree and plant appraisal qualified, and a North Carolina licensed landscape contractor. So he's got a lot of fun accolades. He has also served as an associate voting member of ASC A300 committee, and he's also acted as the president of ASCA in the past. So we've got a really wonderful speaker to join us here today. As always, we're really happy to have Patrick here. Hi, Patrick. How are you doing?
Good. I imagine. Thanks for having me out here. Thanks everybody for inviting me along. I guess I'll take over from here. Um,
Actually, before you take over, we're going to have Katie really
oh,
quickly do
sure.
a quick CEU rundown for those of you seeking CEUs. And then, Patrick, I'll pass it back over to you. We'll get your screen shared.
Go right ahead then.
All righty. Let me share my screen. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you are here today seeking ISA CEUs, please make sure that you have registered. And if you are not a TUFC member, please make sure you have paid the $10 fee. And please also make sure that your full name is showing to get credit. Make sure you're using the name that you registered with. We'll also show a QR code at the end of the presentation just to help us identify everyone who's applying for those ISA CEUs. If you are a TUFC member or just a general member of the public who's just interested in today's webinar, you do not have to pay. Um, so again, just make sure you've registered and pay the fee if you're seeking those ISA CEUs. And during the presentation, if you have any questions, please enter those in the chat and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. And Imagine I'll send it back to you.
Well, Patrick, I know I got excited and I was like, say hello, Patrick, get in there. But now get in there. Now go ahead, share your
Now,
screen and take it
now we're
away.
gonna get into it. Well, again, thanks everybody for having me out here. I really appreciate it. It's always fun to talk to this group and many others. And it was super cool. I mean, man, we have people from all over the country here. So I will admit that some of the things I'm talking about are more geared to Tennessee and the Southeast, but I think we can weave in California and some of these other places pretty easily. So yeah, that's right on. Thanks everybody. So today we're going to talk about oak trees. The name of this presentation is Stoked on Oaks, managing majestic oaks and landscapes. Again, Imagine already kind of gave me a brief introduction here, so I won't go through this. But before I talk to anybody ever, I always like to say things. I always like to ask some questions here. Now, of course, you don't necessarily have to put these into the chat, but what if you could save more trees is one thing I'm always wondering about, and hopefully maybe that's something that many of us here are interested in doing. What if you had more options to maintain majestic oak trees in your landscapes? And then lastly, what if you could keep clients' trees around for a longer period of time? Are these things you may be interested in? And hopefully you said yes to at least one of these things. Because today we're going to talk about oaks, specifically how to maintain oaks. So we're going to talk about what are oak trees. We're going to discuss, we're going to discuss why are we even talking about oak trees? Why are oak trees in decline and what is oak decline? And maybe you've heard of that, maybe you haven't, but we're going to talk about oak decline specifically in the Northern Hemisphere. And then we're going to talk about tools that we can use to combine to help relieve our majestic oak trees from this oak decline in our landscape. So that's kind of what we're going to be stepping out of here today. But real quick, a quick commercial break. I work for a company called Rainbow Ecoscience, and what we do is we produce plant healthcare products and equipment for the green industry. But then we also go about doing things like helping our clients diagnose problems, things of that nature. So three numbers here of what Rainbow is. 1,200, that's the average number of landscape and technical support calls you can that we take any given year, that we actually write down that we take in any given year. So if you have a question about diagnostics, you can give us a call. We'd like to help you out. 150 is the average number of unique research trials we do in any given year. So we have a full research and development department. We partner with a lot of other research institutions, different universities, other private tree care companies and landscape maintenance companies. So when we talk about later on in this conversation, we'll talk about different strategies for helping oak decline. Know that these are backed in science and research. And then finally, six is the number of our core values. And they include things like science and safety, integrity, teamwork, and education. A lot of the reasons why we're here today. But one of our core values is love. And that is things like I love talking about trees. I love helping other professionals take care of trees. I love doing this research and development work here. So that's just a little bit about Rainbow. Um, Now let's talk about the topic of hand, oak trees and what makes oaks special. Um, there's a book, and I'm not sure if anyone's ever seen this book before. It's called Oak, The Frame of Civilization. It's written by this guy, William Bryant Logan. He's from New York. He's a really cool guy. He's written a bunch of different books. He's an ASCA member. I've got to serve on some committees with him. But one of the very first passages in this book about oak trees, he asked this person, Kevin Nixon, who's a paleobotanist, he says, what makes oaks important? What makes oaks special? And this guy's response is nothing. Nothing makes them special, except for you can find them growing from Massachusetts to New Mexico. The thing with oaks is that they've never over specialized. Think of some of these giant, long-lived trees, like, our giant sequoias. They can only grow in like these really thin areas, right? Coast redwoods for the Californian folks out there, right? They can only grow in these specific bands of the world. But oak trees have like taken over like the entire northern hemisphere, and their family expands even to the southern hemisphere. So what makes oak special is that they're super adaptable. Depending upon your resource, there's over 450 species of oak trees. That comes from Wikipedia. If you go to the International Oak Society, you'll find that, and you put in Quercus, you'll find it comes up with over 1,300 results for just that genus alone. And in there, there's 350 hybrids if you go to the International Oak Society. So oaks are everywhere out there. What makes oak special? Again, how we can start maybe even just talking about what is an oak tree in general. One is they have these alternate to sometimes whorled simple leaves. So it's not a compound leaf. It's a pretty basic leaf. Many of us are probably very familiar with an oak leaf. They come in different shapes and sizes, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. The other thing about them is, you know, they evolved at a time, their flowers are pretty unimpressive. So things like magnolias, those are ancient trees that develop, flowers for pollination. Before we had flowers for pollination, we had our conifers that were like they dispersed their pollen by wind, and that was very effective. And then we get these flowering trees with these big ostentatious flowers like magnolias have. Oak trees said, you know what, we're going back to the way things were, and oaks kind of reverted back to this wind pollinated type of way of making their fruit. And so here again, the flowers are pretty unimpressive. That's what the female flower actually looks like right there. Again, that's what's capturing pollen. And then the other thing that makes them kind of special here is their fruit. It is an acorn with a little cap on top of it, which again, we're all very familiar probably with these things that oaks do, of course. But going back to this, just their incredible plasticity as a genus. You can have oaks like this southern live oak that's just massive growing down in Louisiana. Again, I can't remember the diameter of this tree, but it was gigantic. I mean, this spread is well over 100 feet. So you can have oak trees that are just absolutely gigantic. Well, at the same time, you have oak trees that are growing in like the California scrub that just kind of look like these gnarly little bushes and are really, really small. So, I mean, that's kind of, oak trees as a genera are impressive in the fact that they can take on a lot of different shapes and forms and they to adapt to a lot of different places. So that's kind of what makes them unique. Now going back, like even evolutionarily speaking, so oak trees, of course, they're all in the Fagaceae family. So that would be things that we're very familiar of, like beech trees. That's also in that family. But as we kind of go down the line here and we get closer to the oaks, do we have things like the southern oak genera? We find a lot of those there in South America. We have Quercus itself. We also have things like our chestnuts. These are all very closely related trees. And again, oak trees, the first Quercus genus species popped out about 65 million years ago in what was then Thailand. Of course, it was a different looking world back then. And, the continents looked a lot different than they do now. But that's where our first oak tree actually popped out of. And if we dig more into this genus then breaks into, of course, different things like subgenera. And so there's two subgenera of Quercus. You have Cirrus, which are the old world trees. These are ones that we find in places like Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. We're not really going to talk about those because I think most of us here live in North America. And so we have another subgenus, which is Quercus, which these are the New World oak trees. And then they're broken down into three different sections. We have the lobate, which are what we would call the red oak group, which then break down into six additional groups. But things like our northern red oak, and even some of these, like this is a willow oak, these fall into this red oak group. And these are characterized by having spiny bristles at the lobe. So you can see those little bristles on there. And an acorn that takes about 18 months to mature. We then have our next section, which we call our white oak group, which we're all very familiar with, I'm sure. These do not have those spines at the lobe, and their acorns develop, depending upon the species, over 12 to 24 months. And then finally, we have our southern live oak group, which, of course, these were our evergreen oaks that we find growing along the coastal parts of our country. And their acorns mature over a 12-month period. So kind of the different ways we find oaks throughout the US. And the other tough thing with this, of course, is these things can hybridize. So your red oak group trees can hybridize with one another. And so you can find all different size, shapes, and leaves and acorns out there. And sometimes it's hard to really narrow it down into what kind of tree it actually is, what species it actually is. Um, but more about oak trees and then why are they special? So they come in a lot of different forms and they can grow a lot of different places. But probably one of the biggest things is their ecological services. These are huge food sources for a multitude of vertebrates, invertebrates, fungi. Oh, my seeds. I think sometimes we forget about, when we talk about ecology and preserving things, a lot of times we think of the glamour things, right? We think of this is a banded hair streak right now. That's the caterpillar that is an oak specialist. And then, of course, we get this beautiful little butterfly. We think of those things, right? We think of, caterpillars make butterflies. We think of our cute little chickadees that eat the caterpillars again that are feeding on this oak tree. We think of blue jays. We think of this cute little chipmunk that's just going to town eating acorns. But again, this is habitat for fungi and things like that. A lot of fungi out there are beneficial to benign at best, but from a conservation approach, oak trees are huge in conserving a lot of these other organisms as well. So just a neat tree, right? Just a cool tree. And then culturally speaking, oak trees go way back in history with a lot of cultural significance. In ancient Greece, the oak tree was thought to be the sacred tree of Zeus. In Rome, this Corona Civica was a wreath of oak leaves that was the second highest military honor you could give to somebody. You got that if you saved somebody else's life in battle. Of course, the Celts were the Druids, which were their priests and priestesses. That name is derived from oak, what they called oak in that language, and they had sacred groves of oaks that they worshipped. And of course, here in the United States, the indigenous peoples of the Americas revered oaks as sacred symbols of strength, endurance, used them for food, medicine, all these types of things. And then even me, personally speaking, my last name is Anderson. I have ancestry that goes back to Scotland, and the Anderson coat of arms there is an oak tree right there. So again, even for me, I have some affection for oak trees out there. Okay, so oaks are cool, right? Hopefully we got that. They're beautiful, they're diverse. You can find them growing all over the United States, all over North America, all over the Western Hemisphere. They come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and they preserve all types of forms of life as well as the culturally significance to human beings. So oaks are cool. Okay, that maybe we can end the talk right there. But this is what is probably kind of important for us to think about here is that oaks are in decline. Maybe you've heard of this, maybe you haven't, but oak decline is a global phenomenon reported across the Northern Hemisphere. This has been documented in the UK and Sweden, Spain, and Central Europe, and documented here in the United States. And so this is some data from the U.S. Forest Service back in 2024, looking at white oak mortality and forest inventories. And you can see over the past several years that white oak mortality is going up in our eastern forest specifically. This is what we're looking at here. Now, when we talk about landscape trees, which is that's kind of the playground I'm in, right? Like I'm an arbor, most of us here may be arborists. I'm an arborist, so I'm taking care of individual trees and landscapes. So this is the playground I am is in this urban environment. And data would show that trees in urban environments are even in more dire straits than these forested trees. In our urban environments, our trees are exposed to heat stress with this urban heat island effect and warmer temperatures for longer periods of time. Because of the paved surfaces and impervious surfaces we have, these trees are induced to drought. Even in times where there is no drought, a lot of these trees are induced to drought. And then when we do have droughts, it makes even that worse. Due to many different reasons, our oaks are exposed to additional salinity in soils, as well as heavy metals in soils. And we learned I'll make a plug for the Urban Forestry Conference in Tennessee. We learned last year at the Urban Forestry Conference in Tennessee that the heavy metals from brakes. So when you brake in the city and that brake dust comes up, that's full of heavy metals, and that's one of the number one pollutants in urban soils. So we learned that at the conference. There's a plug. Go to the conference this year. And then finally, air pollution, of course, is worse in cities. So we have all these additional kind of cascading things on these trees in cities, which then takes me to this concept of the tree spiral of decline. Many of you may have seen this in the past. This was originally developed by Dr. Mannion. He was at SUNY Syracuse. And what he described is that trees decline over a period of time. And there are three different factors that influence a tree's decline. The first one are predisposing factors. These would be things that we kind of inherit. And now looking at this from the practitioner standpoint, these are things we kind of inherit, right? Where the tree is growing, what the soils are, what the climate is, what the weather patterns are. These are things that the tree is growing in that we as practitioners kind of inherit. We then have inciting factors. Well, let me go back real fast. Predisposing factors. The very first thing you see on predisposing factors of tree decline is the urban environment, right? So if we're thinking that we have global oak decline, even in forests, and then we combine that with the fact that they're in this urban environment, these trees we maintain in our landscapes are already kind of under an additional set of stressors that we would need to think about managing if we wanted to keep them around. So these are predisposing factors. The next thing would be things like inciting factors. These are acute events, but they take a lot of energy from the tree. In the case of maybe defoliating insect, this could be cankerworms, this could be spongy moth, could be other things that would defoliate a tree. This could be a late frost even as the leaves are coming out. Drought is considered an inciting factor when you have otherwise good moisture and precipitation, and all of a sudden you have a period of prolonged drought with heat. These are these inciting factors that, again, sap trees' energy, that then open them up to these things like contributing factors. Contributing factors are often what we blame tree death on. We see things like boring insects, or we see things like cankers, and we say, oh, it was the borer that killed the tree, or it was the canker that killed the tree. When in actuality, I mean, the ecological reason for having boring insects and some of these decay fungi are to recycle dead and dying material, right? Not healthy material. So what we have, we have these trees that have been on the spiral decline for years or decades, slowly being opened up for these other things that then again, we have like our boring insects and cankers coming in and actually killing them. So when we talk about management, which we will talk about management here eventually, we need to think about where can we affect this tree on the spiral decline to keep it from continually going down. So that first image I showed you was developed back in 1981, which is again about 45 years ago if you're counting. This was then kind of reinvented in 2022 by this Dr. Dedman. And what they did is they took the same spiral. So nothing really changes as far as what these predisposing, inciting, and contributing factors are, but they put it in a third dimension. And so they look at it from the standpoint of lifespan of the tree and then time to recovery based upon where you intervene in that tree. And so, long story short, if we can identify stressors on the plant and we can intervene early on, our time to recovery is vastly kind of constricted. It's going to be easier for that plant to recovery. And then likewise, the lifespan of that tree overall, it's going to be able to live longer. So this kind of takes this concept and then puts it into kind of maybe some things that we can do some actions with, gives us some ideas here. Now, okay, that's the spiral decline. That works for any tree. But what are some of the reasons why we're on a spiral decline to begin with? One of the big things is we're seeing altering patterns in precipitation and heat. Precipitation is a big one here. We see that we're having increased winter and spring precipitation with drier summers. And now, of course, this was a kind of a cold winter, comparatively speaking, but you have increased precipitation with mild temperatures. This is a recipe for different disease issues with trees. So trees that have generational lifespans, decade-long lifespans, they react, but they react slowly. They can't react quickly to some of these things. So we're seeing, again, these warmer winters. We're seeing more precipitation in the winter and spring, followed by these extreme drought events. And so this is taken from some work here. This is looking at the upper Midwest specifically, but what I want to show you here is we have this key here, and it goes from blue, which is exceptionally wet, to exceptionally dry, right? So that's like your dark red. And if you just look at this kind of 25-year period, you can see that, all things considered, from 2000 to maybe you can argue 2023, 2024, pretty normal. We're not getting too far outside of our lines here. But starting around 2024, we start seeing extreme. But we start going to more drought-like conditions for a few years. And then for a few years, we turn around and we start going to some more wet conditions. And then we have a spike in droughty conditions. And then we have wet conditions, extremely wet conditions, and then droughty conditions for a while. These abnormal shifts in precipitation, this can be a real stress on a tree. And so when we talk about trees living in these predisposing factors, then combining with inciting factors, these can be this spike like this in 2012, that's an inciting factor to plant decline. So this is kind of the reasons why these trees are under peril. Again, especially here throughout the United States. That's looking at the East Coast, but of course, for California folks out there, you guys had an historic drought followed by atmospheric rivers, right? So those are things that stress trees out in the long term. And so again, summary here, long story short, we're having these changing weather patterns over the past several decades that have really opened up plants to decline. Now, looking at just some more data here, we're just going to highlight three different papers out there about plant decline, and then we'll talk about what we can do to help these trees. So, three different papers here exploring biotic and abiotic factors of white oak mortality across the eastern United States, site and soil characteristics driving white oak decline in the Chicago region, and finally, involvement of soil-borne Phortothera species in northeast Illinois. Rapid oak decline and the effect of site factors on the disease themselves. So the first thing we look at here is this looking at abiotic and biotic factors of wilt mortality in the eastern U.S. And now in this case, they looked at the eastern U.S. as this kind of approximation of states, right? And they looked at weather, or excuse me, they looked at elevation as part of this. And so they were able to develop some climate thresholds for white oak. Now, this is for white oak, right? So a very narrow species here. But they say that for white oaks, ideal summer temperatures are going to be basically between like 70 and 84 degrees. Good spring precipitation is going to be between 6 and 12 inches, and we want summer precipitation of between about 7.8 and 15.6 inches. That's our ideal thresholds. Now, there are key findings here from an abiotic factor, spring precipitation, summer temperature, elevation, winter temperatures, and vapor pressure were sort of significant secondary drivers of oak wilt or of, excuse me, white oak decline. So again, looking again, we have weather here. These changing weather patterns are part of our oak decline complex. Low spring precipitation and extreme summer temperatures increase mortality. Elevation and vapor pressure influence microclimate and water stress, and then soil properties and terrain features, in this case, had minimal impact. But again, looking at our abiotic factors, the changes in precipitation are a big driver. And then finally, biotic factors include defoliation events, to be things like spongy moth, pathogenic fungi like Phytophthora and boring insects. We'll talk more about these here in just a second. Returning to our next paper here, looking at what's driving oak decline, now looking at Phytophthora. And so now we're looking at several different species here, including white oak, northern red oak, and bur oak. 80% of root samples tested positive for Phytophthora species, strongly implicating soil-borne pathogens. So in this case here, again, combined with some of these extremely wet weather events, see an increase in this pathogen driving plant decline. This other study is looking at very similar things, looking at different parts around Chicago, and they find the same thing. Now, in this case here, they found that 97% of declining trees tested positive for Phytophthora. 77% of healthy looking trees also tested for Phytophthora. And they also found in this case here that there was some implications around specific micronutrient levels associated with the soils that they sampled. So trying to kind of coalesce some of this stuff together here, what we're looking at is when we look at oak decline, specifically here in the US, we are having these changing patterns of really precipitation and heat that are creating this predisposing factor or there that are allowing us for things like these inciting factors, like some of these boring insects and defoliators, and then coming in on some of these contributing factors like root disease to eventually cause oak mortality. So that's why trees are in trouble. Now, there are also some other things we encounter in the landscape pretty often in oak trees. Phytophthora is one that we just talked about, right? And so if we look at any disease has to have three aspects. I think many of us have probably seen the disease triangle again. You need to have a susceptible host. You need to have the pathogen. In this case, we're talking about oak trees and we're talking about Phytophthora, but they need time in that conducive environment, right? And so again, talking about the way things are going, where we have longer periods of rain, extreme rain events, especially in the summer and spring, or excuse me, in the winter and in the spring. In the winter, when plants aren't that active, these roots are going to be more susceptible to attack by this pathogen. Phytophthora can be active in soils, as low as 50 degrees, even lower in some cases. So you have a tree that's not able to respond as fast with a pathogen that's more than happy to eat those roots away out there. So this is why we see these issues with Phytophthora. If we can change any parts of this disease triangle, we're not going to have that disease. So Phytophthora, real quick, it's really interesting. It's not a true fungi. It's an oomycete. There are a lot of other oomycete diseases we deal with out there. Interesting enough, the genus name Phytophthora is Greek for plant destroyer. This is a well-known pathogen out there. It does a lot of damage. I know for some of our Northern California folks on there, Phytophthora genera what cause sudden oak death out there in California. What makes them special is that they swim. And so again, going back to soils, if you have saturated soils, this zoospore can swim to its host and cause damage. Early diagnosis of this, now this can be across any species, but early diagnosis of this is when you have a or otherwise healthy looking plant, but you have just kind of like a collapse of one section of the plant. That's telling you that you may have Phytophthora in your soils, especially if it's a tree that's adapted to upland soils or an upland type environment, planted in a low area or that's getting more water than usual. If you're to excavate around there, you would find again these kind of black sucking roots. Other indications of this would be this kind of water-soaked leaf appearance. And then finally, this can also cause cankering. Just mentioned sudden oak death out there in Northern California. This is where Phytophthora ramorum splashes up or blows over in a misty day and gets inside areas in the bark that it can then uh, take over and start causing these cankers that coalesce. Now, somebody asked earlier on, are there any oak trees that are maybe more or less susceptible to Phytophthora? And it's a great question. Going back to Phytophthora, it's if you have a tree that is not adapted to being in a wet area, and I think of like oak, white oaks. If you think of white oaks, they often like to grow higher up on the sides of hills, mountains, especially here in the southern Appalachians. When you take that tree, you put it into an area with heavy compacted soils. You have more water than usual. That's going to be more susceptible to Phytophthora root rot because it's just not adapted to that area. Whereas if you take something like maybe a laurel oak that is adapted to being more in a low area, swampy area, willow oak would be another one. They're going to be more resistant, but resistant does not mean that it can't get it. And many times we do see Phytophthora on those species due to, again, all these stresses that come along. They can no longer fight off the pathogen. The other disease we find really often, now this is more for those of us here in the Southeast, so for some of you, please excuse me as we talk about this, is bacterial leaf scorch. And so bacterial leaf scorch, again, as its name, it's a bacteria. What it does is it's vectored by a leaf hopper or plant hopper. That bacteria, once it gets inside the oak tree, it always has it. There's no cure for it. And what happens is as this disease progresses, it spreads across the tree itself. And what happens is these trees begin then to lose their leaves earlier in the year. Talk a little bit more about here. This is what the life cycle looks like. It's going to come in on a leaf hopper. That leaf hopper is going to then begin feeding within the tree. It's going to regurgitate some of what it's feeding, and it's inner lining of its stomach back up into the plant, and that's what's going to vector the pathogen. And so what this bacteria is going to do is it's going to start blocking the vascular system of the tree, so blocking those vessels. Now, this disease is found in many other plants. Probably don't know all the different plants it can affect. Some plants it shows absolutely no symptoms on. The plant seems to live perfectly fine with it. But other plants, specifically trees in our red oak family, they do something else here. They respond to this vascular invasion by creating these tyloses. So it actually starts blocking off the vascular system of the tree. So not only do you have the bacteria living in the xylem blocking the vascular system, but then you have the tree itself blocking the vascular system. And so because of this, the symptoms you see are drought-induced symptoms. And as this progresses year over year over year, these leaves begin to fall earlier and earlier. And so you have this kind of slow starvation of the plant because it can't produce photosynthesis for as long as it normally would in its usual seasonal progression there. And so, again, this is why this bacterial leaf scorch can be so bad for trees. And if we think about this on the spiral of decline, if you already have this tree that's having these other stresses on it, combined with bacterial leaf scorch, where now you're reducing photosynthetic area for a period of time, this can really start bringing that tree down on that spiral decline, specifically trees in our red oak family. There are treatments for this. This is a tree. This is in central Pennsylvania. This is a research trial that was done in State College. The tree here, these are the same trees. The tree here on the left, this is the year prior to treatment, and then this is the year of treatment. This was a trunk injection of oxytetracycline. Again, does not cure the tree, but reduces symptoms. It reduces the plant's ability, or it reduces the bacteria's ability to continue to grow. The other thing we can use here are things like plant growth regulators. This is looking at soil applications of paclobutrazol on this tree. Again, knowing that this is a drought-induced symptom that we're seeing with the bacteria in the tree working to block the vascular system, and knowing that paclobutrazol and other plant growth regulators can work to induce drought resistance. What you're seeing here is you're just seeing the tree's able to hold on to the leaves a little bit longer because it's able to withstand the effects of that drought-induced issue for a longer period of time. Segueing over to some insect issues that are really common. And again, this is more for our eastern folks. I apologize to some of our Californians and other people in the country, but Lacanium scale is another common urban issue that we find out here in our part of the country. Lacanium scale is a soft scale insect. What it does, of course, is it likes to feed on the vascular system of the plant and essentially robbing photosynthate from the vascular system. When we talk about management of this pest, we want to manage around the crawler phase. This is the young phase. This is what's going to hatch. Underneath here, we have adult females. Underneath her, she's going to lay her eggs. Those eggs are going to hatch, and those are going to be the crawlers right there. Those crawlers, which are going to hatch between 700 and 1600 growing degree days or around northern catawba blooming, are then going to crawl out onto the leaf. And they're going to feed on the, oh, pardon me, everybody. I had a helper come. They're going to feed on that leaf throughout the rest of the season. That's where you're going to see that honeydew, or excuse me, honeydew and then sooty mold come from. And then they're going to overwinter on those twigs. I apologize, everybody. I have a furry partner that really wants to help me with this talk right now. So that's a soft scale we have issues with. We also have issues with an armored scale on our oak trees as well, and that's obscure scale. Now, this is an armored scale, so this is actually feeding on the cells of the plant. And when we think about tree health, trees are essentially sap factories. So if you're robbing some sap, it's not good for the tree, but at the same token, it's a sap factory. It's going to replace that sap, all things considered. Armored scale is pure cells. So from a health standpoint, it takes a lot more energy for that tree to replace cells that are damaged compared to just stealing some sap. So this can be a real health issue for our trees. Find it mostly on our red oak family trees. Again, this is going to start crawling about 1500 growing degree days, and it hatches over a very long period of time. So it has one generation, but hatches over a very long period of time. Now, treatment-wise, there's ways we can treat for these. We can use traditional insecticides like bark sprays of dinotefuran. We can also use novel products like pyroproxyfen, which is an insect growth regulator. And these are great ways to manage scale insects on these trees to help kind of take these scales off of that equation from that spiral of decline. Some other issues that we deal with a lot of defoliating pests. We have things like spongy moth. We have things like cankerworms. We have things like orange-striped oakworm, which orange-striped oakworm, I always say this is like one of these glamour pests. Usually it's only going to defoliate like a branch or a section of the tree, usually not an issue. Here, people just don't like the fact that it produces a lot of frass and that can get on everything. But these have one generation a year and are pretty easy to control. But if you're dealing with other caterpillars or defoliating insects, there are things like soil applied acephate that you can use that are really, really effective on these other defoliating pests. So other caterpillar pests are easy to manage. There's also foliar applied products if you can spray that have very narrow spectrum like Chlorine tranilipro, which is very effective on chewing insects, but has a very low toxicity profile to some of our bees and other beneficial insects. Now, the last ones we're going to talk about here are boring insects. These can be quite damaging. Again, now with our boring insects, they're only coming in on really stressed out trees, right? So that this boring insect is only there because that tree is stressed out. Some exceptions, or maybe some exceptions, again, for our California group, we are right now in the midst of getting ready to do several trials to manage Mediterranean oak borer, trying to learn more about Mediterranean oak borer's life cycle and the responsible way to management. So more to come on that, hopefully more to come early next year on that one. But two-line chestnut borer is a common boring insect on oak trees throughout the majority of the eastern parts of the United States. Can really get on any species of stressed out oak tree. If you're familiar with emerald ash borer, same family. It's an agrylus one. If you're familiar with bronze birch borer, same family, an agrylus borer. Its job again is to come after dead and dying trees, and so it can get into parts of the tree that aren't necessarily dead yet, but create these meandering galleries, which of course cuts off the vascular system and can lead to this what we call this kind of ram's horning. Um, Typical symptoms of our two-line chestnut borer are this kind of dead red and green or green red and dead type of diagnostic symptom here. So thing here is it's only coming after stressed out trees. And again, for those of us on the East Coast, we can find this just about anywhere we have oak trees growing in our eastern forests there. From a life cycle, again, if you're familiar with bronze birch borer or two-line or emerald ash borer, very similar life cycle. It has one generation a year. The adults are going to emerge sometime in early or late spring to early summer, lay eggs, and then that larva is going to feed in the vascular system for the rest of the season, leading to damage to the tree. Now, treatment-wise here, your biggest treatment here is to identify the fact that this tree is stressed. So you want to make sure that you are going to promote tree health using different cultural practices, using things like paclobutrazol and some of these other SARs to help with tree stress is going to be important. And then there are insecticides that you might want to decide to use depending upon the tree, the site, and the severity of the damage. You could use things like dinotefuran or imidacloprid annually. So that would you'd apply those every year in the spring. You could also use emamectin benzoate applied as a lower trunk injection every 2 years to manage that pest. So there's some additional issues that we're dealing with out there with our oak trees. Now, with the last few minutes I have, let's talk about how we can build resilience in these plants, because this is really what we're talking about here. We have these large maturing trees that provide a huge amount of services to us, both economically, environmentally, and socially. And so what we want to do is we endeavor to keep these things around by building their resilience in these difficult growing areas. So the very first thing you could be thinking of, and as I often joke, if your whole plant healthcare program is nothing but correct mulching, that's probably about the best thing you can do for your trees. So oftentimes we have oak trees growing in front yards with turf right up to the base of them. This is an added stress to this plant. So by applying mulch, we see a lot of different things. We see a reduction in bulk density, so compaction. We see an increase in soil moisture content. We see an increase in root density. We see an increase in these mycorrhizal tips, and we see a decrease in soil pH depending upon where you are in the country. So a lot of effects to just doing mulch by itself. You could also take this to the next level. And that would be by doing what we call root enhancement. Again, this was pioneered by the Bartlett Tree Expert Company in the research lab, where what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a tool like an air spade. We're going to be decompacting the soil around this tree. In this case here, we're also removing girling roots, which is going to be, again, a predisposing factor to plant decline. We're then going to mix in prescription organic matter or really properly composted organic matter, any other type of amendment we see that is necessary. This video is taking up in Minnesota where they find the use of biochar to be very beneficial to their soils. And then again, we're going to mulch it all over. And so what we're doing with this process is that we are taking essentially a damaged urban soil and taking it as close as we can to a forest soil as possible in just a short period of time. Now, the other things we could be thinking about are some of these other novel products like these systemic acquired or systemic induced resistance products. These would include things like phosphites, phosphonates, paclobutrazol, even things, natural growth regulators like sea kelp. These are things that induce some type of resistance in the plant to whatever that stress may be. This is looking at an example of phosphite. Many of us are probably familiar with using phosphites to manage Phytophthora, which we'll talk about again here in a second. But what we're looking at here when we apply, in this case here, this inducing agent is that the first three boxes are untreated and our other three boxes are treated. We see increase in things like leaf thickness, defense-related genes, in this case here, a particular plant defense compound, and then finally hormone signaling. So this is how these inducing agents can work in plants to induce resistance. Now, again, these are not like silver bullets. They're not standalones, but you can use these in combination with soil sampling, proper irrigation practices, and that root enhancement process to help trees be more resilient in these urban landscapes. This is some information this was published again by the Bartlett Tree Expert Company and some of their researchers. And what you're looking at here, how phosphites actually work to induce resistance in plants. You're looking at leaves that were infected with Phytophthora over a period of time using these different phosphite products. And essentially what we're seeing here is that these are all soil applied products. 2 days after treatment, there seems to be no differences here. But when we get to a week after treatment, you can see that the treated plants are able to essentially stop the infection in its tracks. Where in contrast, our untreated, you can see that infection continues to grow after being inoculated. So it's a great visual demonstration of how these inducing agents work to help induce a resistance in the plant. Another one that we classically use is paclobutrazol. This is a tree growth regulator. What it does is it reduces the plant's ability to make this gibberellic acid, which is responsible for cell elongation and expansion. And as a side effect of that, what it does is it allows the plant to release other hormones, which can then induce resistance to certain things like drought and disease. This is just looking at some treated and untreated plants. This is looking at drought stress. So this is a picture on the left is drought-induced scorch, and this is a tree that was treated with paclobutrazol, again, reducing that scorch, helping to be more resilient against drought, which we talked about as being a big issue here. This is some data. This was published by Dr. Glenn Percival out of the Bartlett Research Lab in Reading, England. And what we're looking at here, trees induced to drought. Now, these are smaller trees, but this is our untreated plant versus two different rates of paclobutrazol. And we can see we have increased chlorophyll content, decreased leaf necrosis, and vastly increased survival. At the end of this trial, only 20% of the untreated trees survived, while 100% of the treated trees survived. Now, again, these are small trees in pots, but just kind of this describes how this induction of plant defense and resilience can work using these inducing agents. And then finally, we see an increase in chlorophyll production in trees treated with some of these inducing agents. This is again looking at paclobutrazol and the difference between the untreated and the treated there to help with tree resilience in these urban landscapes. So to tie it all together, because I know we're running low on time, think of this as a tiered approach to plant health. And so again, I look at this from a practical standpoint. I look at this as a practitioner that's trying to take care of a property and working with a client. So we can look at this as kind of like a good, better, and best approach. So your good approach would be targeted management of the issue at hand, right? So in that case here, your targeted approach would be we have to manage the scales. We have to manage the diseases like Phytophthora and bacterial leaf scorch. We have to manage the borers, right? If we don't do that, the plant is definitely going to continue to decline. So that's kind of like our good. That's like, we got to start there maybe. Our better, so again, thinking about how we can manage these properties, depending upon resources, time, what have you, right? Our better would be we're still going to take care of the problems, right? We're still going to do our targeted approach to manage insects and disease, but we're going to then do things to improve vigor. This would be the addition of mulch, maybe applying some of these SAR inducing agents, conducting soil sampling and fertilizing based upon the results of that fertilizer. And then our best approach would be doing all of that combined with more intense soil or site modification, which would include things like the decompaction treatments, the incorporation of properly composted organic matter, any other amendment we would see combined again with mulch and irrigation. So this is kind of thinking about how we can manage oak decline in our landscape. Here just kind of like some strategies we can think of to managing these mature oaks in our area. With that, oaks are ecologically important trees. Oak decline is a documented phenomenon that needs to be addressed, and there are several management options for preserving majestic oaks in our landscape. Imagine, do we have questions?
We do, but really quickly, thank you so much for getting through that, Patrick. I appreciate that it was a kind of a comprehensive review of like everything from soup to nuts, if you will, on oaks. So thank you so much. We do have questions in the chat. Katie's going to pull those up in just a second, and she's going to read those out to you, Patrick, so that you can answer the questions. But really quick, as Katie's pulling up those things, before we kind of move into the next section, just some quick updates from Tennessee Urban Forestry Council. For those of you that are living in kind of the southeast, or if you're not, if you want to fly in, we are having a tree risk assessment qualified course in Nashville, Tennessee from April 27th to 29th. Registration is still open on tufc.com/events. So for any of you that are interested in taking your track, I will go ahead and I will plug the links in the chat for you. And if you're a TUFC member, ISA member, and Southern chapter member as well, you get 20% off that whole course. And as you know, it's pretty expensive. So I will plug those things in the chat. And TUFC membership's only $50 annually. So if you really like coming to these webinars, you don't want to have to pay individually and you think they're valuable for your CEUs, go ahead and sign into that as well. And with that, I will go ahead and I will allow Katie to take over and get us into our questions for time.
All right, thank you. Okay. So first question, what's the decline threshold of when to treat an oak in drought situations? Does the client need to soak the soil before or after application?
Oh man, what a great question. Which is, of course, I'm not going to give you a straight answer, right? Because that's a pretty situationally based question. But so in drought, there are metrics for deciding how much irrigation to put on and when to put them on. If you're familiar with the ISA best management practices, there is in the ISA best management practices, and I forget which one now. It might be root management. Imagine I see you nodding your head. You might
Plug
you
it
might
in the
know
chat.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
there are some metrics for when and how much to irrigate. So I would refer to that for your particular soils and situation there. And then there was a second part to that question, Katie. I forget what it was. I apologize.
No, you're fine. Does the client need to soak the soil before or after application?
All right, so if you're going to treat with one of these products, ideally they would soak it before the application because when you do any systemic product that you would use, some of the ones that we talked about, like the soil applied insecticides, you want to encourage transpiration. So having adequate soil moisture prior to application will ensure better transpiration and better uptake of the product.
Thank you. Um, Someone asked, what's the difference between Reliant L and G?
Oh, sure. One's a liquid and one's a granular. That's
All right.
But the long story
How
short, there with the phosphites was they basically no matter what formulation you used, they they work pretty well. So there you go.
how large a girdling root can you remove? And they asked this during the resistant treatment part.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So Dr. Ed Gilman has produced some guidelines on removing girdling roots, and so again, his work is in Florida, mostly on live oaks, right? So you have to kind of take everything into consideration: size, health, vigor of plant, age. He found that you could remove up to a quarter of the diameter worth of roots from a tree. So to put it in terms that I would be able to understand, if you have a 4-inch tree, you could remove a 1-inch girdling root at one event. And then let's say maybe you had 2 inches worth of girdling roots on that 4-inch tree, you can move 1 inch worth of girdling roots this season, and then the next inch the next season, giving it time to kind of respond to that. But again, that's what I would call a guideline, right? You'd need to take other things into consideration, like I mentioned, age, health, all those different things.
Okay. And before I ask other questions, I just want to let everyone know Kevin just put a link in the chat for people who are seeking those ISACUs just to verify your attendance. So you can use that link, and I will pop up the QR code here in a second if you wouldn't mind. if I shared my
Sharing, like,
screen.
yeah, absolutely. There you go.
Thank you so much. Okay, that way everyone can see it, and I will continue asking questions.
Scan it too while we're asking questions. How about
Okay.
that?
All right. And also talking about the root treatment, do you have that video posted anywhere, or do you know where it's posted where people can watch it?
Can certainly send it out. I don't know if we have it posted anywhere, but I'm happy to share it if you want to reach out to me. What is it? DM me. Put in my DMs. I'll send it to you. That's it.
Okay. Um, could you please explain what is a toxicity profile?
Yeah, so I think I was going back to when we were talking about chlorine trinilypril and it being reduced toxicity to bees. And so with that active ingredient, specifically honeybees, they're able to, and I'm not going to get the technical words right because I'm not an entomologist or a vertebrate or invertebrate biologist, but they're able, with that active ingredient, chlorantonilapryl, they're able to essentially clean that from their system. And so therefore it doesn't accumulate to be toxic within bees is how that works. So that's why we consider it reduced risk for bees, and we call it low toxicity to bees. There are actually formulations of that product that don't even have a signal word on them, because not only are they reduced risk for bees like honeybees. They're also very much reduced risk for humans as well, which is nice. We don't have the same receptors in us that the insects do, so that's where it doesn't even necessarily affect us.
Thank you. Next question, and this was also a question that we got before the webinar. Could you talk about laurel wilt in the Southeast?
It can hit the highlights on Laurel Wilt in the Southeast for sure. That might be a whole other webinar. And there's a great researcher up at University of Kentucky that'd probably be a better person to talk about than I. But yeah, so Laurel Wilt was first discovered, I want to say, in the early 2000s in coastal Georgia area. It affects many species, if not all species, of the Lauraceae family. So that's where things like sassafras, spicebush, red bay, which is again, that's a coastal species. That's where it was first kind of found and discovered on. And so that's vectored by the red bay ambrosia beetle. And so ambrosia beetles, they don't actually necessarily feed on the tree. They drill into the tree and then they vector a fungi that then they and their young feed upon. But in this case, that fungi is a pathogen and causes wilt in trees. And so I'm not exactly sure how far it has spread to this point. It's definitely in Tennessee. It's definitely in Western Kentucky. We did research work with the University of Kentucky probably 2, 3 years ago, looking at different ways to treat for laurel wilt. Direct injections of macro injections of propiconazole show to arrest the disease and is a great way to prevent the disease for, I want to say, 18 months, maybe longer. Don't quote me on many of those things, but it's a brief overview of laurel wilt. And we talk more about it.
Thank you. And I have a few more questions, but I know it's 1 o'clock and I know some people need to get off the webinar. So if you would just take a moment to scan the QR code or click on that link that Kevin put in the chat, please do that before you log off. Patrick, do you have a couple more minutes just to
I'd be happy
answer?
to hang out for a little longer for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. Um, Someone asked, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, can Haclo be used as a soil injection during the dormant period?
Yes. So paclobutrazol has it holds the soil particles very tightly, and it has a long half-life in soils. So making applications in the winter time of that is really a good time to be. I wouldn't say a good time. It is a time you could be doing it. Any time is really a good time to be doing it. But it'll stay close to the tree as the tree starts becoming active and starting to take up things from the soil. It'll be there waiting so the tree can start pulling it in. And you'll start seeing effects. Depending upon the size of the plant, it can take anywhere from like 3 to 8-ish months to see effects of those induction or growth control and the induction of some of those plant defenses. So usually what I would tell somebody is if you make an application in, let's say, 2026, you're probably going to see the benefits sometime in 2027.
Is there a quick guide or resource to show what habitat different species of oak grow best in?
Not that I can think of offhand. There are a lot of resources on oak trees out there as far as what they prefer in their habits. I'm thinking of Dr. Durr's book, of course, would be a good one. Eastern Trees of North Carolina by the Audubon Society will have some information on there, but nothing that comes to mind that's specifically to oaks and preferred habitat. If anybody knows one, I would love to know it myself. You put it in the chat or something like that, that'd be great.
And last question. This is a question that came in before the webinar, but and you actually mentioned it to us before it started, but this person asked about what types of pruning are best for oaks, and if reduction pruning is acceptable.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry. I was wanted to kind of address that with when we started talking about plant growth regulators, but um, well, I forgot about really what happened. But so, yeah, I think reduction pruning is a very appropriate thing for oak trees, especially in the context of size management and a way to reduce likelihood of branch and overall tree failure in some cases. So, um, again, that's a quick answer. As you can imagine, there'd be more nuance as, again, the size of the plant, vigor, size of cuts to be taken, those types of things. But an anecdote, I talk about science, and I didn't mention that I had my own opinions, and so I will say things that are definitely done and replicated research, but then I might also have my own opinion. This is my opinion. I have prescribed reduction on willow oaks in Charlotte for years, and it's something I feel like we've seen a lot of benefit from to help reduce likelihood of failure in storm events. So.
All right. Well, I believe those are all the questions I have. Imagine I'll let you wrap it up.
Well, thank you all for hanging on. Those of you that stuck around to hear the rest of these awesome questions, thank you all so much for joining us for another TUFC webinar. We're so happy to have had you here. Patrick, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it
Yeah,
as
thanks.
always. Katie, Kevin, thanks for putting this together. And everybody have a great day, have a great weekend, and enjoy the spring season.
Have a great one, everyone. Thank you so much.